The story begins when Hassan and Mumtaz meet a Hajjah for help. The two men claimed to have obtained a hidden treasure map, which has been around since Anatolian times. The Hajjah was very interested in hearing their stories and was willing to help with the condition of giving the treasure. Hassan and Mumtaz agreed to Hajjah's request and promised to share the results of the treasure discovery equally. The Hajjah immediately performed the ritual with a fist of dry wheat in his hand. Hajjah Abdi recited a spell to protect himself from the disturbance of the genie guarding the treasure. After everything was ready, the three of them immediately looked for the whereabouts of the treasure on the map they had. The treasure lies under a dead tree in the middle of the forest. The Hajjah sprinkled wheat on the treasure land, so that they would not be disturbed by the devil. After that, Hassan and Mumtaz began to dig very deep into the ground. It took hours to find the hidden treasure. The treasure genie hiding in the earth's core knows what humans are doing. Mumtaz managed to lift the treasure chest containing gold coins and silk cloth. They shared the gold in the car, while Mumtaz and Hassan took the silk cloth home. That night, Hassan asked his brother for permission to feed Elif, a woman who was confined to a goat pen. Seeing Hassan approach him, Elif whimpered to be released from the cage. Elif kept screaming hysterically, begging Hassan to help her. Immediately, the wind blew very hard, accompanied by lights flashing wildly. A frightened Hassan rushes back into the house, leaving Elif alone outside. Elif cries seeing the genies approaching her. And the movie started. In a mental hospital, Mert, a young doctor, tries to approach a patient named Asat. At that time, Mert wanted to make observations regarding the alleged mental illness suffered by Mr. Asat. Mert asked how the story of Asat's life until he ended up in a mental hospital. Asat only replied that all of that happened because of the tattooed man who likes to lie. Mert, trying to dig deeper, who the tattooed man Asat was referring to. Unfortunately, Asat diverted the conversation as if reluctant to give an answer. Out of Asat's room, Mert immediately met the next patient, named Muaz. The middle-aged woman just sat quietly on the sofa, while Dikr to Allah SWT. Slowly, Mert approached the woman to greet her. Muaz was silent, refusing to say a single word. Semra explained to Mert that Muaz was the quietest patient in the mental hospital. For 3 years Muaz never spoke to anyone. Intrigued by Muaz's illness, Mert meets his superior, Mr. Kazim, to find out the ins and outs of Muaz. Mr. Kazim said that Muaz had a serious accident while on his way home with his husband. That night, when Muaz had an argument with his husband in the car, a wild animal appeared and immediately pounced on their car. Muaz's husband died on the spot, while Muaz managed to survive but has not spoken again since then. Mr. Kazim said that Muaz prefers to live without talking, and that's why there is no nurse to disturb Muaz. Elsewhere, Hassan united Elif's hands and feet. Hassan said that Mumtaz found a good mental hospital for Elif. The girl was forced to enter a mental hospital, even though her body was healthy and her mind was not lacking. Arriving at the mental hospital, Elif was furious. Elif refuses to be admitted to a mental hospital as a patient. The commotion made Mr. Kazim and Mert out of the meeting room. Mr. Kazim tries to calm Elif down and assures Hassan that Elif will be well cared for in their hospital. Just then, Mumtaz's phone rang, which was from Hajjah. Apparently, the distribution of the treasure was not in accordance with the previous agreement. Hajjah Abdi believes that there are other treasures hidden by Mumtaz and Hassan. Because he was busy taking care of Elif's administration, Mumtaz could not receive calls from Hajjah. They headed to Mr. Kazim's room to complete the registration and left Elif alone in the infirmary. That night, Hassan complained to his brother if Hajjah Abdi kept calling him. Mumtaz asked Hassan to ignore Hajjah Abdi because the wealth had already been distributed. Hassan explained that the assets given to Haja Abdi were not in accordance with the initial agreement. Hearing this, Mumtaz was angry and threatened Hassan to keep his mouth shut. Late at night, Asad woke up in a state of fright, screaming to be expelled from their place. The mental asylum, which was originally quiet, suddenly became noisy as the lights started to break by themselves. Noor, one of the worst patients in the hospital, screamed hysterically in fear. At the same time, Elif experiences an unexpected thing where her body is raped by an invisible figure. During the intercourse, the situation in the mental hospital was shattered. Nurses and medics were unable to calm the terrified patients. After a while, the disturbance subsided by itself. Mert enters Elif's room, a new patient who becomes her first patient. Elif cries and screams hysterically when she sees Mert enter her room. Mert provides sedation so that the patients can rest soundly. In the morning, Mert asked to meet with Semra, a colleague and senior at the hospital. Mert gave a painting in the form of a snake symbol which Noor always painted. Semra explained that his patient, Noor, had chronic schizophrenia which he had suffered since he was a child. Noor even tried to commit suicide for fear of being killed. Even though Noor's family has a lot of money, Noor's life is always overshadowed by fear and anxiety. Mert told Semra what happened last night at the hospital. He saw the patients screaming hysterically without a clear trigger. After confiding with Semra regarding the incident that happened at the hospital last night, Mert returned to meet Muaze on the sofa in front of the window. Mert told about Mr. Kazim's kindness so that he could become a young psychiatrist at the mental hospital. Muaze immediately left Mert, as if reluctant to hear the story about Kazim. Mert turned to another patient, Mr. Asad. Mert again asked about several things that could be used to diagnose mental disorders in his patients. Mr. Asad looks radiant when he tells his life before entering the mental hospital. Asad is a wood craftsman who can make various kinds of household furniture. Mert changed the subject and asked who the tattooed man was who made Mr. Asad go to a mental hospital. The old man immediately stopped the conversation as he said he was going to rest. In the afternoon, Mr. Kazim came to the hospital to check the work of his employees there. Mert advised Mr. Kazim to lower the dose of the antidepressant drug Mr. Asad was taking. Upon hearing this, Mr. Kazim rejected Mert's suggestion, considering that the young doctor had not yet worked at his hospital for a month. Before leaving, Mr. Kazim gave a gift of a luxurious ballpoint pen to Mert. The gift is a tradition at his hospital to familiarize the atmosphere. Late at night, Elif is again visited by an invisible creature who asks for his share. The lights in the entire room were flashing so violently that it scared the patients. Many of the patients ran away while covering their ears because they heard terrible noises from Elif's room. Noor slit his own throat because the anxiety that plagued him that night was unbearable. Semra lost consciousness when he saw his patient commit suicide in the room. After the incident that night, Mr. Kazim gathered the doctors to provide information. After receiving an explanation from the doctors on duty, Mr. Kazim blamed himself for Noor's death. The Tulan doctor said that Noor did have schizophrenia and had attempted suicide before. After the meeting was over, Mert asked for some time alone to talk to Dr. Tulan. Mert questioned the results of Elif's physical examination brought by Dr. Tulan. From the urine and blood tests, Tulan's doctor did not find any abnormality or serious illness in Elif. Mert said that he found bruises all over Elif's body. Dr. Tulan argued that the wound was obtained when Elif was forced into a mental hospital by his family. Mert came out of the meeting room and saw Elif in Muaz's arms. The young doctor asked Elif about her close relationship with Muaz. Elif tells Muaz that he is often harassed by invisible creatures, and only Muaz believes in all of that. Elif also shows all the bruises on her body that are increasing. Elsewhere, Muaz recited the first verse of the Quran, the first verse of Al-Jinn, where a group of jinn who passed by the Prophet Muhammad listened to the chanting of the prayer reading carefully. The jinns who listened to the recitation of the Quran were amazed by the majesty and beauty of the reading as news from the sky about the truth of Allah. Mert returned to Muaz and provoked him to talk by talking about Ilif's health condition. Muaz did not respond to Mert's question at all and chose to continue reading the Quran. Seeing Mert in Muaz's room, Mr. Kazim asked the guard to pay more attention to the young doctor's movements. Apparently, there is a big secret hidden by Kazim, the owner of the mental hospital. That night, Dr. Semra had just finished Nur's funeral and was back on duty at the hospital. A nurse runs after Dr. Mert and Semra calls for help because Elif locks herself in the room, breaking the window pane. Mert broke into his patient's room, which was already covered in blood. Elif still clenched her fists tightly even though she had sharp shards of glass in her hands. Mr. Kazim, who saw Elif's condition, immediately gave a mandate for ECT therapy, namely electric shock therapy, which has been proven to improve schizophrenia symptoms. Elif's body is tied tightly, and her head is attached to an ECT device. After the therapy was over, Mr. Kazim asked a nurse to monitor Elif's condition for the next few days. Mert intervened again in Kazim's decision to perform ECT therapy on Elif. The young doctor returned to the therapy room to check on Elif's condition. Surprisingly, the patient had already disappeared from the room. Seeing Elif suddenly appear with her head upside down made Mert lose control. Mert saw Elif shatter the glass, but immediately the condition returned to normal as before. Mert felt mentally ill this time. Several nurses told stories about their previous patients who were not crazy but possessed by a demon. They called a Hajjah, but the doctors didn't believe it and threw the Hajjah away. Hearing this made Mert think that Elif and Muaz were being bullied by the devil. Mert searched the internet for information regarding demonic attacks, possessions, and the like. Not long after, Semra's doctor appeared to give the diagnosis of Elif's disease. Semra said that Elif did not have a dominant disease. Elif is experiencing a bit of anxiety and is overall fine. After ECT therapy, Elif was confined in a soundproof room. A guard entered the soundproof room to put on a mental patient's protective suit. After wearing Elif the clothes, the guard didn't leave Elif just like that. The man actually wanted to do something lecherous to the point of unbuttoning his own pants. Jinn, who had been married to Elif, did not accept it. Before the eyes of Elif's head, the man's body was made to fly into the air and his neck was broken to death. Elif could only cry seeing the terrible incident. That night, Dr. Mert and Dr. Tulin went to the soundproof room to check on Elif's condition. How shocked they were when they saw a human carcass covered in blood with Elif in the room. Mert returned Elif to his infirmary and let the girl rest for a while. In the morning, Mert begins to interrogate Elif for the death of the hospital guard. Elif gets frustrated and says that she has never committed any crime. Mert is increasingly aware of things that are not normal in the mental hospital. Mert expressed his idea to call Hajjah to the hospital but instead became the laughingstock of Dr. Kazim. Mr. Kazim warned Mert to stay focused on medical treatment. Mert returned to Muaz, who was chatting with Elif alone. For the first time, Muaz spoke to Mert, warning him to always be careful in mental hospitals. Muaz realized that Mert's fate was in danger because he was too deeply involved in Mr. Kazim's business affairs. At the same time, Mr. Kazim met Yasmin, Asat's wife. The woman admitted that she was forced to put her husband in a mental hospital because of the circumstances. It turns out that all this time the mental hospital was just a cover to get rid of healthy people from families who didn't want them. That night, Mert examines the body of the hospital guard who died in front of Elif. Semra enters the morgue and says the guard died of a heart attack. Mert tells Semra about the irregularities in the mental hospital. Late at night, Mert, who was sleeping, was woken up by Elif, who came to his room. The mentally ill patient admitted that he did not know Hassan and Mumtaz. Elif also admitted that his real name was not Elif, but Jinn Hannas. Instantly, Elif's body contorted like a snake, attacking Mert right in the neck area. Mert's doctor woke up from the nightmare and told Muaz everything. Hearing the story, Muaz said that Mert would not be able to cure Elif with medical science. Mert showed the scratch wound on his shoulder that he found when he woke up from a nightmare. Muaz even read a verse from the Quran because he was afraid of what happened to Dr. Mert. Muaz asked Dr. Mert to perform ablution and prepare for the ritual in Elif's room later that night. After informing Elif about the plans for tonight, Mert invites Surma to join the guard. That night, Muaz prayed 2 rakas to ask that his wishes be granted. Mert and Simra picked up Muaz and immediately went to Elif's room. Muaz asked Simra and Mert to wait outside. Muaz starts to recite a prayer and Elif's body begins to turn into a demon. Elif put her index finger to Muaz's forehead. Muaz had vision regarding the existence of the Jinn Hannas who lived in the core of the earth with a burning fire. Elif starts speaking in ancient Arabic saying that her name is Hannas. The genie confessed that Elif's family stole the treasure without their will. Knowing this, Muaz came out of Elif's room with a weak body and was helped back to his room. Muaz explains that the 2 men who brought Elif to the hospital were Elif's family who stole the treasure from the genie Hannas. As long as the treasure is not returned, then Elif's condition will get worse. Mert finds out about Hannas's genie, and plans to take Muaz and Elif away later that night. That morning, Tulin and Dr. Kazim would go to the city until evening. Unintentionally, Mert saw that there was a tattoo on Mr. Kazim's arm just like what Isat had said. After Kazim and Tulin left, Mert sneaked into Kazim's room and stole Elif and Muaz's documents. Mert rushed to Muaz's room to show evidence that Muaz was intentionally put in a mental hospital by his own son who didn't want to take care of his mother. Kazim even gave false health reports of all the patients treated at his hospital. Muaz actually felt sorry for Mr. Isat because he was forced to undergo a series of therapies even though his soul was healthy and fit. Mert insists on taking Elif and Muaz away that very night. Mert asks Emra for help to keep watch. After they managed to pick up Muaz, they rushed to pick up Elif. The hospital guard turned out to be on their side and let Mert go with Muaz and Elif. They had to hide from Mr. Kazim who had just returned from the city. At the same time, Hassan and Mumtaz were beaten by Haja Abti for not keeping their promise. Elif, who had just arrived home, was surprised to see her 2 sisters covered in blood. Luckily Mumtaz was alive and able to talk. They took the silk cloth and the remaining treasures to return to where they came from. With guidance from Mumtaz, they managed to find the place where the treasure was dug. Muaz recited the Holy Quran while returning the treasure to its owner. When Mert was about to bury the treasure whole, suddenly Mumtaz was dragged into the ground and buried alive. The ground that was stepped on shrank by itself until Mumtaz could no longer see the bridge of his nose. Meanwhile, at the hospital, chaos ensues as Mert manages to get away with the fake documents and 2 patients at once. Isat realized there was an opportunity for revenge. Mr. Isat entered Kazim's room and immediately shot the man with a gun until he died. And the film ends.